I feel this point bears extensive elaboration within this piece. The broad claim being made is that there are gendered sexual violences that take place predicated upon functional relations rather than just one-off events. In short, and some systemic issues that arise via iterative actions. The claim is that each instance of the iterative action form may be ethically fine when considered in isolation, but when viewed from afar, above, and below they take on characteristics of ethically dubious sorts of behavior. Rather specifically the characteristics of gendered sexual violence. More hostile readers might do well to interpret this as a theory as to the functional origins of sexual violence in general. The modalities whereby the species tends to rape each other, to do sexual violence towards each other. The reasons and rationales for such behavior, beyond the somewhat insipid reasons that make themselves apparent via the one-off events of gendered sexual violence. Although I am attempting to present the claim in this section well enough that folks can grasp onto it, much of the Rape of the Swan series in total ought be understood as providing such an explanation. This section merely more explicitly states and makes the claims. Hence, readers of whatever dispositional persuasion would do well to understand the series as a whole in that light, and especially the sections following this one as rather explicitly describing these kinds of iterative ethical errors in the species' sexual and love's behaviors. There are, in essence, relational problems between couplings, and there is a possibly biologically driven gender difference therein. Of the possibility of this being a biologically driven gender difference, see the preceding discussions and elaborations in this series. Note though that this section and this series is also holding that the roles of initiator and receiver within the various songs and dances is plausibly the practical mechanic whereby these issues arise. That they may be biologically driven, rather than merely cultural dispositions, is a concern, though not an insurmountable one in any case. The former being something presumably more difficult to deal with than the latter. For that reason, I will be speaking of this in terms of biological sex, as in men and women, despite the somewhat inaccuracy of doing so. This also helps better explain the errors in thinking and behavior under discussion here, as in, such a dispositional attitude exactly formally structures the heteronormative complex. In other words, it is attempting to explain the errors via expressing them within the conceptual framework that they are occurring. Noting that the queer perspective is exactly the one I have, and is exactly the relevant one for discussing the broader issues in regards to men and women construed as such. Doing so is not excluding the queer voice, it is the queer voice. The queer voice being something of an outsider's voice to the gender dynamics and norms predicated upon heteronormativity. Most of the dialogue surrounding the issue of sexual harassment and sexual violence in general is a derivative of the feminine fear of unwanted pregnancy and presumed unwanted sexual interaction, which, to be clear, are valid concerns. Very much less in the dialogue is the degree of the masculine concerns regarding exactly the same kind of thing, unwanted fatherhood, and unwanted sexual interaction. The point in this section is not to denote the masculine's reproductive rights, though men's reproductive rights are something of a serious issue and concern. I mention this because it is indicative of a fundamentally plausibly outdated notion regarding feminine sexuality. A zombie, in thinking that just doesn't have the kind of relevance it had pre-effective birth control. Without being overly flippant in the matter, rape as a concept of a bad has of itself not only the unwanted sexuality as a bad, but also the propensity of there being an unwanted pregnancy as a consequent as a bad. What is bad about rape isn't just the unwantedness of the sexuality, it is also the unwantedness of pregnancy. We may also hold that there are bads associated with the acts of rape as a matter of violence, the forcing of something. But I think that is already largely included in the unwantedness aspect of the bad. The point here though is that the emotive response of fear that undergirds the ethical claims has much ado with the unwantedness of pregnancy, and that much the ado about sexual violence, especially as it pertains to male-on-female sexual violence, is predicated upon exactly those fears. That is, fears of unwanted pregnancy rather than fears of unwanted sexuality per se. Another way of viewing this is that the fears of unwanted sexuality may be predicated upon fears of unwanted pregnancy. Womb-guarding behavior. A kind of behavior that is out of place in a post-effective birth control reality. Perhaps naively, though perhaps such is the correct perspective, held and hold that consensual sex is a good in human life. My primary lovers have tended to hold the same kind of view, important to note as I am in at least part, and perhaps no small part, predicating my analysis upon those dispositions. That is, my own and my primary lovers' dispositions on the matters. Those being the relevant lived experiences upon which I am drawing upon. Sex positivism being the broader philosophical framework I am utilizing. The feminine disposition to guard their sexuality as if it were of great concern is troubling in that regard. The notion of consent culture is its basic manifestation in the current. The notion that there ought be some prescribed, step-by-step, verbally expressed consent as if consent were not already always the case in all cultures in all times is the fundamental issue therein. The notion that saying no is not sufficient in terms of expressing non-consent, but that rather the enthusiastic yes must be obtained is another manifestation of this as a feminine power grab, and plausibly an out-of-control and out-of-time feminine fear regarding their precious pussies, womb guarding. One important aspect therein is the gendered roles of initiator and receiver, masculine and feminine respectively. If there is a gendered equality of form to be had, one would think that these gendered roles ought be less strictly held. Unfortunately, everything I've seen to date suggests that women are not doing so, they are doubling down on their role as receivers. More than that, they are continuing to try and utilize that role as a position from which they can grab at power, rather than skewing the notions of power and aiming towards equality of form, loves, familial forms, and sexual fulfillment. In a world wherein effective birth control is a reality, these kinds of attitudes simply no longer hold near as much relevance. The concerns that, for instance, the wrong guy may be sexual with a woman just doesn't have the kind of meaningful impact that it used to. Likewise, the concern that to have sex entails a kind of risk of lifelong commitment just doesn't obtain. The fundamental structures of the song and dance have changed. That point, and the points that follow are likely to sting at people's sensibilities for exactly that reason. The fundamental structures of the song and dance have changed, whereas their sense and sensibilities of it remain within that pre-effective birth control cultural reality. Culture presents broad consent structures within which folks interact with one another on a sexual level. They create areas wherein it is acceptable for someone, typically the guy, but why not the ladies, to actively initiate a sexual encounter. The context of that is very mutable. Consent as a concept is primarily, firstly, culturally derived, and only secondarily, though importantly, is it a matter of individual choice. The context in which a proposition is made, and by which it is affirmed or denied is exactly culturally derived. Consent modeling that attempts to put the second first are back as wording it, and creating rather significant ethical fouls in the process. The when, whys and hows of the appropriateness of a kiss are given firstly via the culture. The romance of kissing at dark in the rain under a bridge provide the proper context and hence the big yes whereby the kiss can be made. Such is what it means to be an initiator, to read the context of the situation, and to thereby make a move. The enthusiastic yes is an entirely culturally derived thing. It has exactly zero bearing on the secondary notion of consent as being a matter of individually communicated thing. The receiver retains the right of refusal, but does not carry forth the rights of initiation, thus even out of hypothesis. To do so is to misconstrue the entirety of a sexual encounter. The person may change roles, but the roles as such themselves do not change. The circumstances of those roles may change, as in, kissing at dark in the rain under the bridge, could change, whereby this or that circumstance of appropriateness to initiate a kiss changes. Such is merely cultural change. But to hold that the receiver determines the motions of the initiator amounts to a serious kind of sexual violence being committed, whereby the capacity for the initiator to choose to initiate or not is taken from them. It forces them to initiate only at the whim of the receiver. The best example of this, with rather straightforward rules, is the sex club, or the house sex party. In either case, there are designated areas wherein degrees of sexual interaction are simply expected. Typically these are divided up via rooms. There are rooms wherein there ought be no sexual interaction at all, called cooling off rooms, or safe rooms when someone needs a break. The notion therein being rather bluntly that folks ought not even flirt with each other within those spaces. There are rooms wherein flirting and conversational sexual interaction are the expectation. In other words, within those kinds of rooms, if one goes in there, one ought expect to be heavily flirted with, it being, after all, a sex club. What that may entail exactly can vary, most notably as regards to touch, but critically note that the notion that one must obtain expressed verbal consent is not necessarily required. That is, folks can and do plausibly reach a general consensus that, say, within the flirting and conversation room, casual touching, or even heavy petting, could very well be permissible and a norm without the additional caveat that verbalized enthusiastic consent is obtained at each and every instance thereof. In other words, being in the room is sufficient consent. It doesn't have to be, but seriously consider the notion of how mutable that can be as a cultural norm and practice. Perhaps more to the point in the current, that such was a norm of behavior, that such was effectively how consent was understood, and that such remains in large part exactly how consent is understood, ought give folks good reason to pause a bit and better consider the matter of questions of consent. More expressly put, that the ethical import follows the cultural norm, because we are dealing with aesthetical ethical concerns, rather than obligatory ethical concerns. The aesthetical ethical concerns of consent amount to the modality that the communication is given, whereas the obligatory ethical concerns amount to that there be consent given at all or not. There can be rooms wherein private sexual expression is allowed, entailing that simply by going into that room, the expectation and reality therein is that you are going in there to fuck. There is no need, in other words, to expressly say anything at all. Communication has more to it, after all, than the mereness of verbalization. There are rooms wherein folks go to publicly fuck. That is, the expectation therein could be that if you go in there, someone's may watch, or even that someone's you don't know and never said a word to before may fuck you, touch you, in short, be sexual with you. Folks can, if they so choose, set the rules therein differently, as in, say, one must obtain express verbal consent before doing this or that. We can nuance that if we want. But critically the point that ought be understood is that in all of the cases the sexuality is actually consensual outright unless and until someone expressly says no. Both ethically and pragmatically the consent functional concerns are achieved in such circumstances. Folks, especially the more hostile of readers, may do well to understand the enthusiastic consent modeling as being merely one of aesthetic concerns. It is literally just another modality whereby folks set the mood, a certain set of circumstances that entail a proper setting for someone to initiate. It doesn't signal rape or sexual assault or sexual violence if it doesn't obtain, any more than kissing on a boat at sunrise does, because it wasn't done at dark in the rain under a bridge. We might view one as ugly and the other as beautiful, but such is merely a matter of tastes. Nothing more. The wise would view them one and all as sublime. The ethical obligatory concern arises from the no and the ignoring thereof. That is, what constitutes rape, sexual violence, etc., as a matter of obligatory serious sorts of ethical concerns happens via the secondary condition, the saying no, and having that no ignored, or otherwise subverting of the other's will towards one's own, the removal of the power to say no, for instance. Here pertinently, the removal of the powers of determination as to if, when and how to initiate. The removal of the capacity for the initiator to say no by forcing the initiator to initiate in highly specific manners, be that by custom or law. See also the extensive discussion in power dynamics, inequalities. Folks may say something rather insipid like, but I don't want to go to a sex club. I want to talk about the real world, not some sex club. Why insipid? Because of course the dating scene is in essence a sex club. The songs and dances of dating are in fact a literal kind of codified norm of sexual interaction. To be blunt, with a few exceptions there has never been a rape culture as folks are currently expressing the notion. The exceptions are worth noting, and hopefully historically footnoting, to wit, men going to places outside their communities and literally raping and stealing women, etc. Less obvious, and significantly of import to this section, women utilizing their executive authority as receivers to control, manipulate, and effectively rape men within their communities. To be clearer on the point, the setting of the standards of sexual engagement is a modality of control, communication, and manipulation of exactly sexual engagement. To hold that sexuality is only expressible in such and thus a way, is to expressly attempt to control, manipulate, and ultimately sexually abuse someone else. In this section in particular, we are arguing that the feminine demure is exactly the modality whereby primarily women, bit more broadly put, receivers, the subby types, utilize their subby status to manipulate, control, and ultimately sexually abuse the initiators, the dom types, typically men. To avoid being coy about it, whereas the menses may rape with force, the womenesses rape via subterfuge. The former tends to be done as one-off events, the latter via iterative formal structures. It is the feminine demure, the pretense towards the claiming of harm, the utilization of vulnerability, real or imagined, as a means of getting others to do the things they actually want them to do. The point therein being, that the signs on the doorways, the cultural norms of behavior, were the communicative means. To claim within that context that there is something happening that they themselves don't want, is to make the claim that the signs don't apply, only their personal dispositions on the matter. It can and is oft as bad as firstly asking UDTF, getting a yes, and then later claiming that consent wasn't had because WTF is DTF. Or, Netflix and chill, followed by, sure, then, I didn't say yes to sex. The sex club, the sex party, with its room's distinctions is apt for folks to grasp at the nature of the problem. Whereas a non-rapist would read the sign on the doorway, enter here to be fucked, and think, okay, I can go in here and get fucked, or I can choose not to go in there, the rapist reads that sign and says, oh, I can go in there and control everyone within that space so that I merely fuck whom I want and exclude those whom I don't. That is, they act as if the sign had no meaning whatsoever. They act as if no communication happened via that sign on the doorway. By crying foul, they thereby attempt to pull to themselves power of control and manipulation over the situation whereby they themselves have sole determining power as to the ground rules of sexual engagement. To be uber fucking clear on the point, cause I know there are swaths of people who are profoundly confused on the topic and no small number of bad faith feminine actors. The hostile audience to this, the persons who ignores the clearly stated rules of engagement, cultural norms of behavior, is actually ignoring the consensual framework. They themselves are the rapists. They ignore the culturally accepted norms of behavior, the clearly stated rules of sexual engagement that are mutually worked out between people, and instead say, no, only I have control over the determination as to if, when, how and with whom sexuality is to occur. Utterly failing to even grasp that sexuality, unless it's actual masturbation, actually entails another person. It's almost as if such folks don't even think of others as people, but merely think of themselves. Give them a fuck doll and watch them be happy for once. If I said to someone, look, you can go in that room, but when you go in there, you have literally no say whatsoever as to if, when, why or how you are being sexual, most folks would look at that and say, that's dumb, I ain't going in there, that sounds like rape. Cause it is. Yet, this is the exact gendered proposal presented in the current by the subby, primarily by women, more broadly by the receivers, that they and they alone have the capacity to set the ground rules. Again and again, read the sign over the doorway, all who enter here get sexual. That is the communication, not the individual person-to-person dialoguing, and certainly not the one-way subby role of dictating terms of sexual engagement. The rooms whereby you know you're going to get fucked by basically anyone in there, and the rooms whereby you have no say in the matter are different rooms. Rather specifically, because in the former everyone retains the right to say no at any given point, in the latter only one person, one party, one sex has the right to say yes. The signs over the doorways being the cultural dispositions, the cultural norms of behavior. And note of course that there are multiple rooms and multiple signs on the doorways. 'Cause I know there are folks who just have a hard time getting that point. The exclusive right to say yes to something entails that there is merely one way, that person's way, to approach, to initiate, and indeed, to have sex. Their way or no way. Rapists, all of them. This bears a deeper analysis because of its subtlety and its far too oft ignored status. As illustrative as the sex clubs and sex parties are, the issue is relevant in the day-to-day lives of people. It is most evident in long-term relationships, though it has a strong relation to cultural dispositions of women in mate selection in all cultures, more generally of receivers in all cultures. First, let's examine how this phenomenon manifests in long-term relationships, and then we'll examine how it manifests in broader cultural structures, and ultimately, in the day-to-day interactions of dating and mating rituals and behavior. In a long-term relationship, the questions of when and how to have sex become nuanced. There is a very uncomplicated sense in which the lovers have broadly agreed that trying virtually any sex act together is not only permissible but to be encouraged. This is most evident in long-term monogamous relationships, wherein the lovers have pledged, agreed, etc., to only be sexual with each other, and hence, to in some very meaningful sense fulfill each other's sexual needs, wants and desires. Note that, to the rapists out there, this is not the case. To them, they and only they have the rights of determination. Consider the absolute absurdity of having to ask permission to sexually touch one's long-term lover. Martha, it's been 50 years, and I know you tell me you love it every time, still, the consent cultists say I have to ask your permission and get an enthusiastic yes before I caress those sweet tatas of yours. If I don't, I could literally go to jail and have my entire life ruined. The dynamic has changed therein. The assumption is no longer mere assumption, that is, the reality is that your longtime lovers actually generally want to be sexual with you. That your lovers need, want, and desire you is a given, and that there is an obligation on the part of everyone involved to exactly meet those needs, wants, and desires. Such is strongly analogous to the sex room in a sex club wherein those within are prima facie allowed to be sexual with you. The big yes has been given in such circumstances. The little no's remain available, but the notion that anyone would have to ask merely displays the stupidity, or perhaps the illiteracy of the folks suggesting that the big yes hadn't been given. Can you read the sign over the doorway or not? When that understanding is broken via use of the supposed executive authority of women to control if, when, and how to have sex, the sexuality of the man becomes performative, unwanted, unfulfilled, unsatisfied, and so forth at the least. This section will argue that such becomes tantamount to or actualize sexual assault and rape in its most egregious forms. Consider in the context of the question of if to have sex at all at some given point in time. For sure the right of refusal still rests with both parties. But when the roles of initiator and receiver continue within the bounds of long-term lovers, in practice that right of refusal rests only with the woman. We may hold that technically the man has the right to refuse to initiate at all, but the determination as to if there is agreement between the lovers remains exclusively with the woman. It is best to understand this kind of situation as a bit of a caricature whereby the man is always the initiator, and the woman is always the receiver, such that no sexuality at all happens unless the man initiates something. Caricature though this may be, it nonetheless maintains significant import in the reality of the lives of many, perhaps even most people. Of these aspects, one that is fairly important to note is the constraint that sex simply doesn't happen without someone initiating. Here, and a bit of a caricature of it, we are speaking of men. Hence, if sex is to happen at all, then the initiator has to initiate something. Among other things, this likely leads to the impression that men are always DTF. After all, if they are the ones initiating, they must therefore be DTF. Such of course is not the case. Initiation of the sexual act doesn't necessarily entail that the man was rip-roaring and ready to go, but rather that the man is fulfilling their role to initiate the act, set the mood, etc., not just for their lover, but also for themselves. I'd go so far as to strongly suggest that in instances wherein the initiator, the man typically, begins to not initiate, and that sexlessness intrudes upon the long-term relationship, that such can be caused by exactly this sort of dynamic being described, that is, a feeling of unfulfillment at the least, at the most, a feeling of being poorly used, sexually assaulted, and raped. It is noteworthy that in such circumstances, what is popularly within the discourse is some issue or concern for the woman, and not the man. In other words, the poor woman who must endure a sexless relationship. Conversely, a poor man who must endure such things is oft not given the courtesy of concern. After all, they must have done something to deserve it. The always DTF trope of men, far from being a patriarchal structure per se, is better understood as an integral aspect of the heteronormative complex, something that arises from how the highly gendered roles interact. The always DTF trope services not merely, that is, a patriarchal structure, but also services its matriarchal counterpart. I'd go so far as to say that the always DTF trope does much more to service the matriarchal component than its patriarchal counterpart. To assume that the man is always DTF, after all, grants a kind of freedom of form for the woman, never to question the reality of the situation. They are free to assume that such dispositions speak towards their personal beauty, their personal grace, that the guy is definitely horny, and that they can do with that as they wish. They needn't question the motives or the situation. For them that yes has definitely been given, and moreover, there isn't really even a possibility of a no within that. That is, insofar as the initiator is indeed initiating, there are no no's possible. At least, according to the insipid receiver. To the receiver, again, it would be easy to mistake the role of the initiator as that of the aspect of always being DTF. To them, each and every instance of initiating, after all, looks like an instance whereby the initiator is DTF. The reality is definitely not such. For the initiators, The point can best be understood by reminding the reader that absent any initiating at all, there simply isn't any sexuality that happens. For the initiator, in other words, they are presented with the following: I am not necessarily in the mood, but nonetheless I ought create the mood, and indeed she, more broadly the receiver, isn't necessarily in the mood, and thus I must also put her in the mood. For the initiator, making love out of nothing at all is a very real sort of thing. It is true that as an initiator there is something of a sense of desire that is had, the appearance, existing love's connections, relationship dynamics, etc. all can and do play a role in also creating the desire in the initiator in order that they initiate at all. For the receiver, this entails dressing up, playing the part, being available, setting the stage, and so forth. The gentler readers, and indeed especially the hostile readers, ought well note how nicely that dovetails with the aforementioned points that the big yes are accomplished via broad cultural agreements, the signs over the doors, the accepted norms of behavior, rather than the literal affirmations via vocalizations. Hence, we can get a good sense of the basic mating behaviors and ritualized norms of sexuality as they play out along gendered norms, but also a bit more broadly in terms of initiator and receiver, which is applicable regardless of gender disposition. We'll expand upon that a bit later in this section. The point at the moment is for the reader to grasp that the initiator may initiate without actually being in the mood, without actually being DTF, without actually already feeling rip-roaring and ready to go. Indeed, this can go so far as to note that the initiator can and oft does in fact initiate not with any sense of desire as such, but rather with a sense of future aims, fulfillment of duties, or really a wide variety of other plausible sorts of aims. One of them being something as simple as wanting to fuck, even if they are not actually in the mood ATM. To initiate into a sexualized ritual and mating behavior, in other words, may and oft is in fact towards aims of some future-looking state, rather than anything akin to an immediate sexual desire. This is especially obvious in longer-term relationships, whereby it is, or at least I thought it was, well understood already between the lovers that maintaining a good sexual, loving relationship is of paramount importance to the quality of their lives. Hence, for the initiators, to regularly and persistently present to one's lovers is an active effort to maintain and create the good loving conditions for the lovers in the longer term. Motives vary, but beyond the simple motives of sexual desire, DTF, there are such things as concern for the other person's sexual desires, gasp, I know, consideration of someone other than yourself, emotive bonding via sexuality, livening up of their sex lives, seeking to comfort them, making up after a fight, something fun to do together, making one's lovers feel loved, wanted, needed, and desired, showing care and compassion, etc. Such digresses a bit, such is my habit, and with my habit is the relevance of the reader to have such things in mind as were written, as they do bear some importance, digressions though they may be. In individual instances, there is literally nothing at all wrong with this kind of arrangement, that is, with the arrangement of a gendered initiator and receiver, or more generally, of a delineated functional role between lovers. Upon iteration, however, serious problems of internal relationship dynamic imbalances occur. Critically therein, my strong suspicion is that these imbalances made significant sense pre-effective birth control, women's executive rights of refusal therein was in essence ethically predicated upon the right to choose to not get pregnant. When that concern is largely eliminated via effective birth control, that kind of imbalance in powers of determination as to if, when and how to be sexual significantly changes. Specifically because the iterative formal structure takes on a more immediate reality and ethical import than the mereness of a single encounter. To be blunt, the species can fuck a lot more, the iterations of the relevant events happen far more often, both in terms of the selections of lovers and in terms of the acts of sexual encounters between existing lovers. What might have been masked via marriage as an exclusive state of sexual love's musings, and of pertinence via the guarding of the womb lest there become long-term commitments involved in sexual activity, are masked and pertinent no longer. And such is a good. Sexuality and loves are goods, not bads, and there is more of the good available, not less in virtue of modern effective birth control and indeed, sexual liberation. But, the ethicity of the situations does in fact change. In particular, the iterative formal structures become more relevant. The more religious of folks may well muse such as being indicative of a closer state to the eternal, and hence to the divine. The patterned forms of loves themselves. Not something to be lamented about from a religious and faithful perspective, though something with an ought of attachment to it for them to fight for it. There is again a temptation to hold that women aren't there merely to please their lovers, that feminine demure as if they themselves don't love sexuality, that they are somehow doing someone a favor by fucking them, and as if men are always DTF, that men are there to merely pleasure them, etc. In point of fact, especially in long-term monogamous relationships, and more broadly still, in any long-term sexual relationship whatsoever, the whole point of the sexual aspects of that relationship are exactly to pleasure one's lovers. Such is not to hold women, or men, as some sexual object, or to own them in any meaningful sense at any rate. The point therein is to note the rather boring fact that each lover's needs, wants and desires ought be met by their long-term lovers, insofar as such is really feasible. In the instances of when to have sex in a long-term relationship, what becomes rape of the man therein is when the utilization of the executive authority by women creates the situation wherein sexuality effectively only occurs strictly on the woman's own terms. When it is used to control, manipulate, and exploit the man in the relationship. When it is used to get something that the woman wants within the relationship, perhaps especially something non-sexual that the woman wants. And when in effect, the needs, wants and desires of the man become sublimated to the woman's. In the currents among the big bads out there to be countenanced against is the more cultural-wide dispositions to place such in the hands of women in general. That is, not the individual cases, which are illuminating as to what the nature of the problem is, but the attempts to be thwarted to have such become a cultural norm or indeed even legal structure. Such is an attempt to legalize mass rape, and ought be understood as such. Such exactly comes to degenerate the man's needs, wants and desires towards the exclusive aim of fulfilling the needs, wants and desires of the woman. It is to treat men as tools for the woman's exclusive pleasure and authority to use, or not, as they so desire. To put it in somewhat trivial but illuminating terms, suppose that a man wants to have sex in the morning, the woman says no. No sex happens. Cool. Later in the evening the man tries again, and the woman says yes. Sex happens. Cool. No issues whatsoever. However, suppose that happens regularly, wherein the man is horny, his sexual needs, wants and desires happen in the morning, and the woman says no each and every time. What happens effectively is that the woman takes control and sex happens at the time of day they prefer. Now, there is literally nothing special about the woman's preferences in this regard. The man's preference has to matter too, if we are aiming for any sense at all of equality between the sexes. Effectively, the man's preferences are forced to conform to the woman's preferences. Suppose further that the man doesn't really feel like having sex at that time, but comes to expect and indeed know that the woman will only have sex at that time. We may hold of course that he could still refuse, but that isn't really the point. The point therein is that the woman has effectively manipulated the man to have sex. And in what sense is that not rape? The reader, especially the hostile readers, ought recall that men are not always DTF, that the role of initiator carries with it certain kinds of behavior norms as noted and alluded to earlier. I know, can practically feel the response especially by the hostile women, that the man is obviously sexually available, and hence there is no problem with the situation whatsoever. This is the rapist mentality, especially the feminine rapist mentality. To expand on this point, it can be tempting to suppose that the man must have wanted it, if, after all, they were the initiator of the act. In other words, that their role as initiator grants them the option to express or not, and if they express, they are expressing and hence consenting. There is a kind of nominal and insipid sort of truthiness to this point. Their consent occurring regardless of the motivations involved. In other words, even supposing that the man wasn't DTF, was manipulated, controlled, and connived into initiating the sexual act, they nonetheless consented to it via their initiation. It's seriously worth noting that this highly structured gendered role analysis doesn't really do justice to the circumstances. Nonetheless, it is very relevant for understanding how iterative sexual violence occurs. See also the extensive discussion on this point in Power Dynamics, Inequalities. Noting that there is consistency between that piece and this one that I'll largely leave to the gentler readers to expand upon and express. Here I'll simply note the similarity between the cool whatever attitude about the unwanted kiss, and the cool whatever attitude about the unwanted sexuality being discussed here. Likewise, the similarity between the problems of being stripped of power, one-way determinations, and systemic, iterative issues versus those of one-off events. We may conceptually play with this notion a bit, and hold something like, if the man refuses in the evening, then no sex happens. Cool enough. If this happens repeatedly, however, no sex happens at all, and we end up dealing with a rather foolish battle of wills between the lovers. A battle between lovers whom ostensibly want sexual interaction, but each effectively forcing their own particular desire as to exactly when upon each other. Kinda what we'd expect from individualists. In this instance, we are specifically examining the role and capacity of the receiver, generally the woman, and in some meaningful sense of the sub, to effectively manipulate, control, sexually assault, and rape the initiator, generally the man, and of the DOM. Compare, after all, the notion of a man pressuring a woman to have sex. Or the notion of emotionally manipulating a woman to get her in the sack? Or the notion of tricking a woman into sexual acts? Or the notion of physically forcing a woman to have sex? Or the notion that a woman is obligated via her role to do so? In each of these cases, the notion is that there is a lack of agreement, some kind of force being used to manipulate the situation in order to obtain the desired sexual outcome. In each of these instances, we can and oft do hold that there is something bad therein. Oft taken to extremes of accusations of rape, sexual assault, etc. But here the point is thus, such is the case when it happens to women. When it happens to men, folks are generally celebrating its happening. Folks seem to be somewhat thick-headed when it comes to this point. I can literally describe the exact same set of circumstances for a woman, and folks' indignation will rise, their fervor of fear and horror will come forth, protect the ladies, they will shout. Such is, after all, the heteronormative complex, isn't it? And such, after all, services the matriarchal components therein well now, doesn't it? Freedom for women to rape at their leisure. Of course, there are some rather simple sex-positivist solutions to this sort of dilemma. Namely, sex isn't a bad unless there is something else that makes it such. Loves are not bads unless there is something else that makes them as such. I fuck her because she asks, because I love her, and it isn't that big of an ask to do so, because it is just fucking, it is just sex. Moreover, I love her, so there is good to be created via the actions of sexual love's expressions. That she does the same for me for exactly the same reasons are the relevant solutions involved. There isn't, in other words, a bad involved in the actions themselves. Sex is not in need of redemption, nor is love's, barring of course that someone does something to make it thus. For the rapists here, they come to be fairly synonymous with the sex negativists and the individualists, each of whom hold to something akin to sex is only a good for the pleasure of it, and hence, only good for the pleasure it so happens to give them in the moments of it. Sex and indeed love for them are things that have a bad connotation to them, to which they and only they can rectify, make holy, or at least wholesome, via some witful word, twist of tongue, or unbated breath that says the required magical phrases to make it thus. It is worth noting that the genders therein needn't be relevant. We would expect that same kind of dynamic in any instance in which one person is expected to always or primarily initiate, and another person is expected to always or primarily receive. That there is a gendered component therein is relevant, that is, women do tend to be the receivers, and men do tend to be the initiators, as a matter of pragmatics in the cultural analysis, but folks ought not mistake that as anything akin to holding that there is something necessary about those relational cultural points. Indeed, even if there turned out to be some form of biological disposition towards these roles, we ought still hold that that is not therefore indelibly a part of the species. Biologies can change even through such ephemeral and playful constructs as cultures. Is may not imply ought, but ought can certainly imply is. In terms of the species' current cultures, whereby the receivers are granted a supposed, though perhaps not always actualized, executive authority to control and manipulate a situation towards their own ends, in what sense is that not exactly rape culture? Consider even the vaguest notions in the current discourse, that sex ought only be done on the woman's terms. That she has to give the enthusiastic yes before something can happen. These kinds of notions belie any sense that the man, the initiator more broadly, ought have any say, concern, or even the plausibility that they may have their needs, wants and desires fulfilled. Such is predicated upon the notion that men are DTF and that women are somehow or another doing them a favor by fucking them, as if they themselves didn't want the sex. The nominal aim of making sure the receiver is happy, is being fulfilled, becomes the entirety of the sexual discourse, ethical concern, and indeed, comes to define, rather egregiously, the terms of any sort of sexual interaction whatsoever. If we simply remove the terms initiator and receiver and instead said that it is only proper that one party in a given sexual encounter ought have their needs, wants and desires fulfilled, that one party ought have total control over the situation, there would be little doubt in anyone's mind that what we are describing is a kind of rape, perhaps sexual slavery. When we begin to speak of men and women, initiator and receiver, however, folks instinctively and almost unthinkingly suppose that the poor woman must be protected, that the big bad man must be the problem. Indeed, that it may not even be possible to rape a man by a woman is a commonly held notion. The funny thing about projection, after all, is that of the folks screaming the loudest about rape culture signal that they themselves are the rapists. To quote the Metatron, you women, always thinking someone is trying to get in your knickers. In terms of sexual types of acts, the instance becomes even clearer. Vaginal, anal, and oral. Suppose that a woman wants oral a lot. The man isn't particularly down for it and is wanting vaginal sex. One can practically feel the inclination that the man should do it to please the woman. By that I mean, if one just listens to women's complaints, you can get that feeling, that sense, that what they are saying is that the man ought to fulfill that desire. Suppose the woman continues to have executive authority on the matter. She outright refuses to have vaginal sex, she just wants oral. Every time the man initiates, she refuses vaginal intercourse. Again, one time, fine. An occasional thing, fine. Something done for love for her, cool. Outside a long-term relationship, fine too. A fling is a fling, whatever. But within the bounds of long-term relationships, that behavior shifts the sexual acts towards something the man didn't want at all. The man was doing the oral to pleasure the woman, to meet her needs, wants and desires, not because he necessarily wanted to himself. He was doing you a favor, not the other way round. To be clear, the man wanted vaginal sex, the woman oral sex, and due to consistent iterative use of supposed executive authority on the matter, the woman ends up forcing the man to have oral sex even though he doesn't want to. How is that not rape? Sexual assault? Manipulation of someone to perform a sexual act. Again, compared to the notions of a man pressuring a woman to do some kind of sexual act. In the current, the situation is so absurd that the notion that a woman would do something just to pleasure their lover at all is viewed, poorly, as if that were tantamount to rape. The horrors involved via such an imposition upon her. Someone bring forth the fainting couch please, there is a woman in deep duress. If that rape point isn't clear, consider the notion of grooming, manipulation, etc., the pick-up artist, who doesn't take no for an answer. The person who insists that this thing or nothing. The person who puts another in a position wherein they ethically have no other options, especially in monogamous relationships, but also in polyamorous relationships wherein there is a meaningful commitment on the part of everyone involved to exactly meet the needs, wants, and desires of everyone involved therein. Unless we hold that women are weak and inferior, which I do not personally think is an ethically tenable position, how can it possibly be that in the case of a man sexually harassing a woman, wearing her down until she finally says yes be understood as effectively rape, and it not being the case that when a woman does it to a man it isn't also sexual harassment and effectively rape? Folks ought to hear echoes of patriarchy within, say, the various sacred texts that beholden the woman in particular to fulfill the needs, wants, and desires of their chosen lovers. I know that is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, but it may very well be the truth, and it may very well be the case that such is a kind of dictum of norm to counter exactly this sort of iterative sexual violence. How far do those notions work to curb the executive power of women in regards to sex, more generally of the receiver role, the subby role, within the bounds of long-term relationships? And likewise, within the bounds of society more generally. To reiterate the point, there is no ethical difference between the notion of a woman doing a sexual act they didn't want, and a man doing a sexual act they didn't want, unless we hold that somehow or another women are in point of fact weaker, inferior, pathetic, and vulnerable, really children after all, incapable of taking care of themselves without the aid of the menses. There is a temptation to hold that we ought to merely do sex acts to which we not only agree upon doing strictly in terms of desires of the moment, but which we also have a fundamental meeting of the minds to do. This takes the plausibly valid ethic of dating into the bounds of a long-term relationship where it very likely is not valid. It is also similar to, and perhaps some motivation of, the enthusiastic yes as a norm. In dating, whereby there is little understanding between the potential lovers, there is something valid to be said about talking things out, feeling out the situation, being open and honest with each other, and only really settling with something that feels right. There is a kind of skittishness about the situation, an uncertainty about the others involved, worrisomeness. Course, even that attitude makes far more sense in a reality of more egregious consequences of sexual activities. The concerns, in other words, that sex produces babies, which means lifelong commitments. In the current, the concerns are a bit more ephemeral, perhaps having far more to do with uncertainty as such, rather than uncertainty about anything in particular. Still, we ought hold there is something to the validity therein to hold to a kind of concern about who folks start any kind of sexual encounter with, and that there is something to be said for a meet and greet, a get-to-know-you kind of thing, and in early sexual encounters, a sense of caution such that one only does what both currently have a meeting of the minds on, and feel good with. However, in the longer term, and in the sense of iterative actions, be that between existing lovers or towards potential lovers, such a disposition becomes timing to everyone involved, and likewise leads towards the most restrictive form of sexual interactions. It lacks daring, courage, and in some sense beauty. There are bads associated with the disposition that only really become apparent via the iterative form, but which are rather blatant in that formal structure. While those iterative aspects are the main thrust of this section, I want to reintroduce folks to some basics about longer-term ethical considerations. Consider the notion of comfort sex. To some women this may read like comfort women abused in wartime. Understand, that is a linguistic aspect I am not at all referring to. To be blunt, I as a man have regularly provided comfort sex to my lady lovers. That is, I regularly have had sex wherein I wasn't enthusiastically on board at the moment. The reason why being so dumbly simple idk how anyone can disagree with it with any seriousness of intent. I wanted to please my lover. I love her. Why wouldn't I do exactly that? One would have to hold to a profoundly sex-negative viewpoint to think otherwise. That kind of ethic of sexual loves, however, has to go both ways, or all ways, or it just doesn't functionally operate well. Moreover, and this again touches on a point I don't think receivers, women in this culture, typically get, so much so that it bears repeating to try and drive the point home. Just because a guy initiates, doesn't mean they were necessarily rip-roaring and ready to go, or even particularly interested. Willing perhaps, but that kind of willingness may have far more to do with an understanding as to the relevance of doing something for one's lover, culturally agreed upon norms of behavior, the bonding that occurs through sexuality, and the importance of maintaining a good sex life especially in a long-term relationship. As the earlier examples demonstrates, such can also be far more ethically dubiously an action that is done through manipulation, coercion, and control, e.g. rape, rather than anything even hinting at willingness. Consider the notion of orgasm. The common complaint, unsure its degree of validity tbh, that women don't get to orgasm. The man orgasms, and doesn't continue with the sex to their lover's orgasm. There is every sense in a long-term relationship wherein the man ought to continue to fuck their lover's post-orgasm, in one way or another, until she has her own orgasm. As I said though, such presents itself as a kind of ethical ought as opposed to some sort of terminal law of necessity. As I understand it, when the man orgasms, they are very oft no longer in the mood. Compare after all to the notion of a woman in the middle of sex, changing her mind, and no longer being in the mood. Women have come to literally call that rape. How is it any different? I want to be clear here though, I am not necessarily saying that we ought to call such rape. I think that the issues therein are a bit more subtle and deserve more careful consideration, and bluntly I think that such consideration ought be stemming from a more masculine source, as in the current the feminine voice on the matter has been predominant for perhaps too long. Perhaps too, a lonely sort of feminine voice. The point here though is that if we are to consider these sorts of things rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, etc., then it is so regardless of the genders and sex involved. That there is a gender difference in the treatment is a serious ill, and is strongly indicative of rather obvious sorts of gendered norms. Woman victim, man perp, man DTF, woman no like sex, etc. They are indeed so obvious that they ought be in the crosshairs of every feminista out there. Again, and to the point of interruption, how is that meaningfully different than a serious ought of ethical validity whereby the woman also ought to get the man to orgasm when they are wanting it? Again, not suggesting there's anything ethically wrong with this or that occasion wherein someone just isn't in the mood, but upon iterative use of the supposed feminine executive authority, it begins to look highly dubious ethically speaking. One would have to hold that there is something meaningful about the temporal differences therein. In one case folks agreed to have sex, in the other case there isn't necessarily an agreement therein. Is there a difference in the ethicity of the action because one is done in the immediate and the other is done through the iterative form? There is certainly something ethically dubious about the latter. Iterative formal structure is cultural formal structure. Iterative sexual violence is rape culture, the cultural disposition to casually rape, sexually assault and sexually harass without even a hint of there being something wrong with it. Indeed, with it being actively celebrated. We'll find again that the point is a matter of understanding or failing to understand basic cultural agreements. Reading the sign, failing to read the sign, or pretending that the sign doesn't pertain to you, whomever you are. Consider such rather strictly, and hence a bit poorly, in terms of the mereness of agreements. In the former, more immediate of cases, we are holding that there is something ethically valid or invalid predicated upon the agreement or lack thereof to do all the sexuals. In the latter, we are holding that there wasn't even the notion of agreement involved. It isn't that, in other words, there was a moment whereby some decision was made, rather, there are simply the iterative actions, each of which on their own merits, considered in isolation, may even have had agreement or not to the actions. In other words, no one agreed or not, no one even bothered to ask at all as to if and how those actions may have affected form upon the iteration of their use. They simply did them anyways, knowingly or not. In terms of yes and no's, as the go-to metric of determination of agreements or not, such entails that at least there be the asking. In the sense that there isn't even the asking, we may very well hold that such is cheese, quite rapey in its formal structure. Moreover, we might also hold that the lack of understanding involved by the victims thereof entails a sort of quite gross manipulation of the situation. I hesitate some as I want to give the benefit of the doubt to the perps thereof, that perhaps they simply did not really get it either, or that perhaps they simply have not considered it. However, such presumes a fair amount of ignorance, and ignores a fair amount of rhetoric and historical information, namely, that sort of modality of manipulation is hardly anything new, and is oft enough actively praised in the pop discourses on the topic, as in, "You go girl. Get yours and rape that guy," kind of thing. To reiterate to the point of clarity, suppose that in the case of the immediate instances of rape, there was no asking involved at all. There wasn't even the chance to say no to the event at all. Not, that is, that the issue would be, no one verbally asked, but rather, that there was no possibility for the person to even say no to the events happening. Someone just came up to them, covered their mouth, and started fucking them, or started fucking them while they slept. We tend to call that rape, specifically because there wasn't even the asking, even though technically the person never said no. See the questions of the sleep fucker a bit later in this section though. The same is true for the iterative form of the event. Somewhere along the line in the process of repeatedly using the supposed singular executive authority to say no, the receiver is actually doing so in such a manner that they force the sexual interaction towards what they need, want and desire to the exclusion of the initiator's needs, wants and desires. Indeed, they may go so far as to sublimate the needs, wants and desires of the initiator as if they were their own. That is, they may end up manipulating and controlling the situation and circumstances to such an extent that the initiator comes to actively believe that they are doing only what they want, or they may celebrate that they are only doing what their lovers want, and hence, become in essence sexual slaves. In crude, blunt, and therefore somewhat telling terms, the notion of not getting a woman to orgasm is considered an ethical travesty of the highest order. Alas, that poor man is so terrible in the sack that they cannot even manage to get their lover off. Never mind that he didn't feel like it, never mind that he didn't want to. What matters, after all, is that the woman gets her vaginal spasms on. Whereas not getting a man off, that is considered, well, at the least not the woman's fault, duty, or obligation. At the worst, the notion of being obliged to get your man's rocks off is thought of as an actual crime called rape, to which men are literally thrown in jail for. Of course, the proper ethical modality of sexuality is the endurance of love's passions to get everyone to orgasm, the kind of ethical obligatoriness that accrues in iterative form. Threesomes are a very good example of this. Regardless of the bodies involved, the sexuality therein is intense. Very oft folks within a threesome get tired, worn out, used sexually. But it exactly isn't a negative experience. The desire to exactly be used sexually in that context is what is sexually fulfilling therein. Frequently within a threesome, one continues within the context, regardless of their sex, exactly towards the fulfillment of the needs, wants, and desires of the others involved. There is every meaningful sense in which when folks have a threesome, they are fundamentally agreeing to satisfying their lovers. Understanding of course that such remains an ethical ought rather than some unbending law of necessity. The right of refusal therein remains, in other words, but it is seriously tempered by the ethical ought. Critically, the enthusiastic yes doesn't come into play. The yes is assumed within the context of the sexual relationship at all. It is within these sorts of contexts that the feminine demure is very apparent. The pretense of weakness, vulnerability, inability, the pretense too of needing to be convinced, of indeed wanting to be convinced, all towards the aim of obtaining the kinds and sorts of things that the feminine may need, want or desire. An unbending law of necessity offers no room for such things. It may, indeed, trample too harshly. An ethical ought, however, whereby the dependence of its validity is squarely upon the nobility of the persons involved, that they are indeed each and all acting in good faith towards each other, wherein in these instances, when we speak of good faith, we are also speaking of good sex, that is, to act in good faith towards each other as sexual lovers is to act towards the fulfillment of each other's needs, wants and desires. Within that context, the feminine demure can thrive, and likewise it can also become very abusively used when it is not done in good faith. When the demurred, the receivers, those to whom the power and grace has been granted of executive authority do not act in good faith towards their lovers, such becomes rape, sexual assault, manipulation, sexual harassment, etc. Consider such from the perspective of the naive lover. The person who just assumes out of hand that their lovers will treat them well, and that indeed, their lovers also are there to be lovers, that their interests are genuine, that their sexual interests are real. To such a person, the notion of having that kind of naive grace granted towards one's lovers whereby in the songs and dances of it all, they have some significant degree of executive authority over them entails a great deal of trust. That the naivete and genuineness of their own loves and sexual interest isn't thereby used against them in the process, especially not towards the ends of sexual abuse, sexual assault, and rape. Given the various gender tropes and dialoguing on the matter, it is plausibly best for the readers to pretend for a moment that it was happening to a woman, take that sense of indignity about it, and apply to a man. Which I know will be difficult for a disturbing number of people. That difficulty stems quite literally from their inability to so much as view men as human beings worthy of dignity. I'd again suggest for the gentler readers that these kinds of iterative sexual violence concerns may very well be what motivates the various ethical imperatives associated with marriage, as in, what are oft enough and at least sometimes somewhat dubiously referred to as the patriarchal religious structures and the patriarchal institution of marriage. That is, the notions that point towards the wife in particular as being ethically bound to please their husband. I'd likewise again stress that personally I am far and away more advocating for an ethical imperative of mutual pleasuring as an aim. Here I am pointing out what strikes me as a rather strikingly plausible rationale for such clauses in the long-term relationship agreements that folks have traditionally made. Specifically, again, as a means of creating an ethical imperative to counter the iterative forms of sexual violence that arise, as are being described here. To reiterate to the point of clarity that the supposed exclusive executive authority of the receiver, especially in the context of pre-modern effective birth control, was exactly counterbalanced via the marital claim that in particular the woman ought understand her sexual role in the relationship as being that towards the pleasuring of the man. My strong suspicion is that in a postmodern effective birth control reality, that kind of arrangement is somewhat odd, to put it gently. That the gross categories of initiator and receiver are not as warranted via the biological underpinnings upon which they rest, and that the context of marriage, more broadly of long-term relationships, entails a concept of mutual pleasuring as an aim. That the iterative sexual encounters with differing and existing lovers each already entails a kind of renewed but novel sort of ethical arrangement. One in which the feminine demure is perhaps far and away less so demurred, and that along with it some fair amount of the sexual abuse of men may be stemmed. For the selfishly inclined, the more hostile of readers, consider the plausibility that the en masse rape of men by women, the en masse sexual using and abusing of men by women may lead to men doing violence of their own. That is, it certainly ought not surprise anyone that if someone is being abused, sexually violated on the regular like, they might also end up doing so in kind. In other words, we might ought understand such as defining the primary causes of sexual abuse more generally, rape little boys, rape little girls and boys. So too with little girls to little boys and girls. A solution on an individual level, boys don't cry. Shocker, I know. Blanket consent in long-term relationships, the question of the sleep fucker. There is a notion that it is fundamentally unethical to wake someone up with sex. That, in other words, they didn't expressly consent to the sex, hence it must be rape. This is correct in some instances, but fundamentally off in most instances. 2. For instance, ask for blanket consent from one's lovers that is it okay to wake you up with sex entails of course that consent was given without some strange immediate ritualized asking beforehand. The right of refusal remains, of course, but that is the power of the no. The notion therein rather bluntly being that the notion of an enthusiastic yes as a requirement for consent to occur is off, and rather radically so. More than this, there is a meaningful sense in which if sexuality as such exists within a relationship, the act of initiating sex at any given point is ethically valid. Again, the right of refusal therein remains, but the big yes of ethical initiation is also present. My suspicion is that folks who are dialoguing about the enthusiastic yes are doing so from the exclusive perspective of the receiver, and acting as if the receiver fundamentally doesn't have any sexual desire of active form to their behavior at all. Moreover, I suspect that such talk has a bit more to do with casual relationships, hookups, and dating cultural expressions than anything like longer-term relationships. As is being intimated and explained in this section, and indeed this series, I also strongly suspect that such dispositions have to do with power-grabbing and expressions of rape culture, whereby men are en masse raped by women. Fundamentally, I strongly suspect that all such talk boils down to a kind of irrational fear response on the part of the receiver. One that is best understood as a kind of trauma response. It is irrational in the sense that it doesn't comport well with reality, not in that it doesn't purport or pertain to something that has happened to the person. In other words, especially as regards folks that have actually been traumatized via rape, sexual assault, etc., their response is rational, reasonable, understandable in the sense that they are responding to something that actually happened, and indeed, actually does happen. Their response may be irrational in that its applicability or proportionality of being reflective of the reality is exaggerated, and perhaps greatly exaggerated. For folks that have not been raped or sexually assaulted, the discussion is really just completely irrational. That is, they themselves are not responding to anything that has happened, and they are acting in a way that is greatly exaggerated from reality. To hold, for instance, that someone may not give consent even though they didn't say no, because they are frightened, is a true statement. That does in fact happen. However, how often that really happens, and what kind of response we really ought give to it varies a great deal. We could take such as being a problem without classifying such as being sexual assault, rape, or any such thing. I know for some folks out there the notion of not righteously punishing the wicked is likely going to strike them as off, but it's off the better and true course. Sometimes unwanted things happen with no one really at fault. We could do so simply in virtue that there wasn't anything like lack of consent given. The other persons involved, in other words, not only had no way of knowing that the persons didn't want it, but also it may very well be the case that by all indications, cultural, perceptual, etc., the person did in point of fact give consent. All this talk of the intimacies of existing long-term relationships, consent, and such has a parallel within the public sphere. As noted above, folks who think that they aren't living in a sex club, but rather a dating scene, are truly missing the reality of cultural songs and dances. Provided there is broad social agreement as to if, when, and how to approach folks one doesn't know, there is validity exactly in the approach. There is no obvious reason, for instance, wherein men and women ought not have as a part of the songs and dances of dating the practice of touch involve, even rather explicit sexual touch. I am not suggesting that they have to. I am saying that in the matter of broad cultural understandings there is no sense whatsoever wherein sexual touch has to be considered off limits. There is, to be as blunt as I can about it, nothing inherently ethically wrong with including sexual touch in such things. Its ethicity is exactly something that is culturally defined. As culturally defined things, these kinds of actions' ethicity is obtaining via the aesthetical considerations of the songs and dances of sexual behavior. Folks would do well to refer to the ethical discussions in The Odd Questions of Privilege, A Slight History of Colonialism. If, in other words, folks broadly agree that greeting a prospective lover by gently caressing their genitals with a smile as indicating rather directly their sexual interests, that by definition is not rape or sexual harassment. Such is the whole point of having some kind of cultural sexual norms in place. It is ethically permissible behavior, because there is nothing unethical about sexual touch as such and because consent is a matter of cultural understanding and little more. We may hold that there is no such agreement, we may even hold that we don't want such an agreement, and I will point out that I am not necessarily suggesting that become the agreement. The point is that therein such becomes sexual harassment exactly because we agree that it is outside the cultural norm, but we have to understand how culturally relative these kinds of things really are, and that their harms are far more aesthetically motivated than anything else. Likewise, that the degree of seriousness by which we take such transgressions of cultural norms of behavior ought be seriously considered and very carefully so, as I am fairly positive that when folks take them too seriously, they are actually committing a big bad. That we could do so, and that for relevant instance the sex club actually does understand such as being the agreement in certain rooms informs us that such is plausible not as sexual harassment, but as cultural agreement to the norms and practices of initiating and receiving sexuality. My observation regarding safety culture is that such is taking these things dreadfully seriously, throwing a lot of predator intention around wherein there very well may be little more than differences in opinion regarding what the songs and dances of sexuality in the dating world ought be. My suspicion is that the queers and women are leading this kind of understanding, perhaps with the notion of sexual rivalry underpinning it. The bland recognition of the heteronormative sexuality as such, the songs and dances therein, followed by a sexually motivated challenge to it that demeans the songs and dances therein as strange and predatory. Moreover, my observation is that, again, the disposition of women in particular to demur their sexualities, to not admit that they enjoy sex, to hide themselves, to want control, and to want to manipulate and to want to choose their mates predicated upon a notion of guarding their womb is currently out of control and out of place within the context of sexual liberation, modern effective birth control, and multicultural living. What may have been a very valid concern regarding exactly guarding the womb pre-effective birth control, manifesting as an out-of-control safety ethic, that is simply invalid as an ethical concern within a post-effective birth control reality. My very strong suspicion therein, if folks are done with power-grabbing about this shit, is that for any sense of gender equality to manifest itself, women ought to begin initiating far more. The dangers of being openly sexual with others has been significantly mitigated via effective birth control, safer sex practices, and online dating. Does this section forget much of loves? Does it focus too much upon the sexual? Does it risk being read as a mere reduction of humanity to sexuality? I suppose it may. What is missing most is the notion of friendship between the sexes. The notion that the predominance of sexuality as such is also a major issue. Perhaps this section, however needs to be stated, ought be understood. After all, one hope is to provide some sense of a bridge understanding between the sexes that is broadly applicable within a post-effective birth control reality, regardless of the cultural contexts that it is occurring. In many ways, the position of friendship between the sexes encapsulates much of what is needed. Sexuality as such remains a concern, perhaps mostly because folks have made it such a concern. Again, I ought to say, I tend to come at this from such a naive position regarding sexuality, that much of the ado regarding sexuality seems so fucking strange to me. The risk therein, that I am deeply missing something regarding sexuality, regarding loves, perhaps regarding reality as such too. Still, with that in mind, there is something to the experiences of the masculine in relation to the feminine worth noting, perhaps especially within the cultural context of the current. After all, what happens upon iterative form within the context of long-term loving relationships is happening in iterative form within the context of the dating scene, is happening within the context of sex work, and is happening within the context of the culture at large. Such, after all, is how fractal forms functionally iterate. Such is, after all, how cultures are crafted. Were it oh so simple to stop playing the game and just say hello.
Юу гэж хэлэх вэ?